This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Andrew McAfee, Andy McAfee as he likes to go by. We are talking his new book, The Geek Way, the radical mindset that drives extraordinary results. Andy happens to have a cool perch up there at that fine university, MIT, the Massachusetts Institute for Technology. Or is it Massachusetts Institute of Technology? I'm not sure. Anyways, MIT, we all know it. This Geek Way mindset is it. It's the way I live my life. It might be the way you live your life. It might not be the way your neighbor lives his life. But guess what? Over time, the Geek Way is going to win. No doubt. Without any further delay from me, let's jump right into my conversation today with Andy McAfee. I hope you enjoy. Andy, let's dive in here and I'll give a little bit of a setup. I'm a guy who had no tech background, political science major, George Mason University, but I saw Netscape go public in the summer of 95 and I was like, uh-oh, game on. And I've been playing around with the email probably starting in mid-1994. But I was like, oh, I need to get a website up for the content that I'm involved in, this trading content and whatnot. And it was a race. It was like, I got to get something on. And I think my first e-commerce sales were in early 97. So, and pretty much have kept one of these big expanded shops with a ton of staff. I like to be lean and mean. I've got people in disparate locations helping me to get things done. And that's the way I've done it. But I like to think of myself as a geek in a way, even though I had no training in the computer science world. I had to figure out, after I paid a Russian programmer $4,000 for a 4-page website in 1996, and he disappeared, I had to figure out, how do I reverse engineer this HTML code? Because if I don't figure out a way to make these web pages go long before there was any WordPress or any of that nonsense, then I'm not going to be able to participate in this world that you and I are going to talk about today. So that's the setup. For me, I will always think of life for me is basically when Netscape went IPO, that was game on. It's different for people today that are a little bit younger. They're not going to relate to that, but that's still game on. That's summer of 1995.
Yeah, absolutely. And what that story tells me is that you're a geek. And I don't mean somebody who's really into computers, because like you say, you came from a different background. That was not the world you grew up in. But when you came across something that you found super interesting, this thing called the web, a Netscape IPO, you then became, if I'm hearing you right, obsessed with what this thing could be and how you're going to participate in it. And the fact that you didn't have a deep background or a lot of training didn't get in your way. You kept at it until you got on top of the problem and made some headway on it. To me, that defines you as a geek. Number one, coming across something that you can't let go of, that you get obsessed with. And number two, just working the problem and being willing to go wherever it takes you.
Yeah, exactly. What age I would have been in 1996, I was probably 27. So not really an established career, bouncing around. I just finished an MBA program in my mid-20s. And then here I was. I felt like it didn't make a difference what the hell my plan was or anything. When Netscape went public, it didn't matter. We had to adjust to that. That was my feeling.
Yeah, exactly. And the business geeks that I talked to and that I learned a lot from when I was writing The Geek Way, it feels to me like most of them had some similar moment. I'll tell you a quick story about that. I interviewed Patrick Collison, the co-founder and CEO of Stripe. And you probably know the story, Michael. Patrick and his brother, John, founded the company when they were 21 and 19 years old, respectively. They were farm kids from Ireland who started Stripe, which is now just shaking up the global payments industry. And I said to Patrick, what on earth told you at this age of 21 years old that you should start a company to go take on all these incumbents, all these giants in the financial services industry? What possibly could have possessed you? And I loved his answer. Like you, he said, my brother and I got obsessed about, in this case, the mobile revolution, the social revolution that was happening in the early 2000s. They started programming for the web. They were both coders. And they started thinking about a business. And he said, we realized, he had this great phrase. He said, you could set up every aspect of an online business as fast as you could type, except for taking a payment, taking a credit card from a customer. He said, the instant you wanted to do that, you were back in the world of faxes and phone calls and these day-long processes to be able to take a credit card number from a customer. And he said, we realized that commerce on the web needed something different. And we looked around, we thought we were just missing it, but we weren't. And the two of us looked at each other and he said, that's the problem we're going to go after. We're going to increase the GDP of the internet by making payments easier. And it was just that clear and at the same time, that fuzzy of vision that led these two geeks to go start this world-changing company.
When did they launch that? Do you recall?
They were in private beta for a long time. Did they launch? I want to say 2007-ish, but do not quote me on that.
So just to share with you back, I was faced with this issue in 1996. I was like, okay, how am I going to process credit cards? And there was something I found that was going to allow me to process credit cards. My first two sales, which were $1,000 sales for training courses, were frauds. And so then I was like, okay, now I'm really effed. What am I going to do? So in early 97, what I figured I could do was basically a secure server form dump to get the information. And then it was literally a manual processing through the flower company. Teleflora had a non-floral merchant ability to process credit cards. So even at that point in time, I didn't think to myself, how can I do this? Because it felt so far away. So it makes me admire even more the Stripe guys because they felt like they could jump into the middle of that. But I remember facing this very issue, even perhaps a decade before they were starting. How can I process credit cards? And it's quite amazing. Even Netscape goes public in the summer of 95. How did all of the banking giants not figure out a way to solve this problem within 6 months?
It's amazing, isn't it? It just keeps me going back to something I learned from Clay Christensen, who I taught with at Harvard, and he was a colleague and a mentor of mine. And he just kept pointing out how vulnerable incumbents are when the world shifts underneath them. In this case, the technological world, when the web appeared and became this vehicle that we were all going to use for commerce. The phenomenon I'm talking about in the Geek Way is another technological shift, but one that's not as obvious. And what I mean by that is the company is a technology. And I'm not trying to be cute or play word games. The company is a technology. It's a thing that we humans invented to let us accomplish our goals. And my point in writing The Geek Way was that that technology has received a major upgrade because of a bunch of geeks, lots of them concentrated on the West Coast, lots of them concentrated in the tech industries. I think Stripe and the Collisons are a great example, who realized that in order to compete and win in this very strange world we were creating with all these new technologies, you needed to run your company differently. You needed to upgrade that technology. The geeks have upgraded it. They're showing how well this upgrade works, not just in online payments, not just in high tech, not just in Silicon Valley, but it's a better way to go about this hard job of running a company. And because it's better, it's going to spread.
I was thinking about this in advance of the call with you, is it's not only, if we look at the S&P this year, it's the big tech companies, those 5, 6, or 7 are basically all of the S&P gain. So that's an interesting conversation right there to talk about those particular companies. But I think what's interesting about this Geek Way mindset too, is it applies to me. It applies to Matt Taibbi writing on Substack, probably making millions of dollars, probably have a much nicer life being Matt Taibbi writing on Substack, making millions versus clocking in for Rolling Stone, where you have this editor and that editor and all this other stuff. So I think your direction that you've gone, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this applies to the big operations and the small operations.
I'm glad to hear that, because I think exactly the same. A lot of the case studies and examples that I draw from are companies that we've heard of. I also talk about a few companies that I don't think we've heard of as much. I believe that this approach to getting things done, this geeky approach, is super broadly applicable. And it consists of some very simple things: following the evidence as opposed to your intuition, working quickly, iterating as opposed to planning, distributing authority down to an uncomfortable level, and just this very basic ability to admit when you're wrong, when you need to pivot, when what you're doing isn't working very well. These things all sound relatively easy to do. Just look at how well large incumbent companies are doing, and you'll realize they're actually incredibly difficult to do. And the geeks have been working on how to get these difficult behaviors installed in their organizations, no matter how big or small your organization is, no matter how big the team is, whatever you're going after, adopt these geeky practices will help you.
What's really interesting too about this delineation that I'm drawing between big corporations and the individual is some of these individuals are taking their one-man shops and turning it into Hollywood powerhouses. For example, Mr. Beast. For example, Marcus Brownlee, the tech reviewer guy. These guys just started a decade ago, 12 years ago or whatnot, doing geeky YouTube channels with no viewers, and they just stayed on it and stayed on it and stayed on it through some weird, crazy obsession. And then everyone wakes up in 2023 and they're like, oh my God, how did Mr. Beast make $1 billion? Well, he had the Geek Way figured out early on.
And in particular, a couple things. These folk, as they were putting their content out there, they were seeing what worked, what resonated with people, what drew an audience. My guess is that in many, if not most cases, what actually drew people was probably a little bit different than what they were originally thinking. So then they pivoted, and then they went where the evidence about what their audience wanted was taking them. The other thing they do, and you pointed this out, is they just tried stuff. They didn't put together a 5-year plan for dominating YouTube. They just started putting content up there. They learned about how to do that. They learned about what their audience wanted. They learned how to be more proficient and professional over time. They try stuff instead of engaging in a ton of upfront analysis and planning. Those are both super geeky habits.
No doubt. And I can think back to when I launched this website of mine back in the day, 96, 97. For the first 6 months before there was any revenue, I could see the traffic. I could see the emails coming in. I could see the interest. But I guess like the YouTube guys, a decade or so later, same thing. You can see something's buzzing. So it kept me hooked. I was like, wow, okay, there's people here. I'm putting out, trading and investing content. So I can see that people are interested in it, even though it wasn't originally a business. It was just this way to share with people. And then the business came later.
Now, my guess is that if you had been putting that content out and there was no buzz, there was no traffic, there were no emails, there were no anything, at some point you probably would have said, this idea isn't working. You would have gone on to something else. Again, it's this idea of our instinct is really important. Our judgment is important to get us to start doing something. After that, I think one of the hard skills the geeks have mastered or are working on is the skill of the pivot. Is, man, I believed in this. I thought it was a great idea. I put it out there in the world. It is not working the way I thought. I'm not going to sit around and wait for the world to realize how brilliant I am. I'm going to realize I have to go do something different. And so when I look at these geek companies, their nimbleness always strikes me. And we have this stereotype, which is largely true, that bigger companies move more slowly. And yeah, that's largely true. Amazon is a gigantic company. Is it slow moving? I don't think it is. When I look at the pace of innovation that comes out of a pretty large company like Stripe, for example, or Tesla or SpaceX, these companies have figured out something about how to remain agile and nimble and seize opportunities, even as they acquire some size and momentum. That's a really neat trick. I don't think we've seen it a lot before.
Let me see if I can phrase this thought, this idea. I brought it up earlier, and you just brought it up now. This collection, this handful of very large tech companies that we all quote, know and love, essentially want to talk about every day. They've done the Warren Buffett thing pretty quickly, relatively speaking. They've built the moat. I don't know. I guess Mr. Bezos can screw something up and somebody's going to penetrate Amazon and somehow or another take over what they've done. But it looks tough. And it looks tough to kick Google out. Maybe there's something underway with the AI chat stuff that's going to do it. But some of these tech companies, this handful, have developed these moats. So I guess what's interesting for me is the lessons that we can learn. I'll add a little more grist to the mill here, so to speak. I've noticed in the last handful of years, I haven't seen them for the last 18 months or so, but a lot of these videos are coming out where the nice young lady was showing up at Facebook and with this whole walk and talk, getting her cafe and sitting on the bean bags and playing foosball. You're sitting there watching this and going, hold on, I thought these were some of these really innovative tech companies that Andy is talking about. And then I'm seeing all this waste and grift and whatnot. Map this out for me. We get these tech companies that are the big winners. I still remember the InfoSeeks, the Excites, the Lycos, all that stuff. But we got the big winners now. We got the big moats now. Do the lessons change for us that we can learn from the big players?
I think the biggest lesson is don't believe in your own moat. Let me flesh that out a little bit. If I were going to look and pick two industries 15 years ago, if you asked me to pick a couple industries that had very wide, very deep moats, and keep in mind, 15 years ago is we're into the era of the web, we're into the era of social media and starting to get into mobile communications. So the advertising and the media industries were looking a little shaky at that time. So I probably would have gone somewhere else. I would have said, okay, what you want to look for are industries with entrenched incumbents, with a lot of money, well-capitalized incumbents, very high barriers to entry, probably a lot of capital intensity. You just have to spend a huge amount of money to even participate in these industries. Deep experience with supply chains and dealing with their channel partners and all of that. And I probably would have said, okay, here are two industries that the geeks are unlikely to shake up. Number one, auto manufacturing around the world. And number two, rockets and satellites. I have trouble thinking of a more capital intensive, incumbent heavy, entrenched industry than launching rockets into space and putting communication satellites on them. Wow, would I have been wrong about where the moats are 15 years ago? And now we have two of the companies Elon is associated with. We've got Tesla deeply shaking up the worldwide auto industry. We've got SpaceX deeply shaking up the worldwide rocket and communication satellite industry. This happened in a short space of time, and it happened because, again, somebody got obsessed with some very, very tough problems, didn't let the barriers, and there were real barriers, there were real competitive barriers to entry, get in their way, and just keep trying stuff and show progress and get to the point where we are now. Michael, my point in telling you that story is that be really careful about thinking that you have any kind of static defensible moat. The moats change over time. And I think the only, probably not even a guarantee, but the surest way to stay ahead of them is to not believe your own moat and keep looking around for what's going to come and build an organization that can react quickly to the new thing that appears. So given all that, Amazon looks like a pretty durable company because it has seized so many opportunities, demonstrated an ability to be nimble. But man, the competition is always a click away, and there's going to be some well-capitalized new entrant gunning for you. This you can almost guarantee.
It's interesting to bring up those two examples, cars and rockets. I guess the issue there for me, it's the imagination issue because the capital needed to pull it off. But the last car I owned was a Lexus, but I can think of something like looking at my father's Ford truck and whatnot, getting inside, and the thing, it looks like the interior innovation has basically been unmoved for decades. And if I think of the government, well, does it surprise me? Even though I don't have the access or the understanding that Elon had to launch SpaceX, does it surprise me that the government was screwing everything up behind the scenes? Elon clearly knew SpaceX was going to be an opportunity. It is interesting. If we were to have the discussion right now, what would be some of those things that are wide open? It seems like the bigger and bigger opportunities, though, get narrowed and narrowed down.
They start that way, but then they broaden out pretty quickly. So keep in mind, SpaceX started with rockets. And then at some point, Elon realized that it was feasible to make high bandwidth, portable, rugged, relatively inexpensive satellite internet terminals, and that the incumbents in that industry were actually not anywhere near the frontier of performance of what was achievable. And he's shown us that with Starlink. I also interviewed the CEO, Will Marshall of Planet Labs. And Will used to be an actual rocket scientist at NASA. And he participated in a few launches at NASA. And he just said, this is an extraordinary culture inside NASA at some ways. They are really, really good at rockets and satellites, but they are fault intolerant. They're very, very risk averse, even for an uncrewed mission. And so he said, look, I thought, and my colleagues thought, that if we were willing to be a little bit more accepting of risk and a little bit more willing to move fast and to use cheap components, so if something blows up, it's not a catastrophic financial loss. If we were willing to do all those things, could we start putting up cheaper communication satellites? And he pulled out his phone and he showed it to me. And he said, the bill of materials on this phone versus a communication satellites has very, very high overlap. They have almost the same components. They actually shot a smartphone into space just as an experiment to see if you could get a picture back from a phone, I'll say this again, in space. And they found they could. And they said, look, this $500 device is almost ready to go to space. A communication satellite costs about $500 million. And then Will had this great phrase. He said, what are those extra 6 zeros doing for us? And how many of them can we realistically shave off and still get good imagery of the Earth down to the Earth's surface? That's what they're doing. It's another example of there are big opportunities here. The landscape is currently dominated by slow-moving incumbents. We're going to go after this, and we're not going to be afraid to dream big. It's a very geeky approach to the world.
Let me get you to contrast geeks. And if you need to give a little more definition to geek, I think you've already done it, but if you need to give a little more, feel free. But why don't you contrast geeks at that point in time, let's say Andreessen, Netscape, IPO, summer 95, versus geeks, summer 2023. What's the difference right now? Is there a difference in the geeks, or is it still just the same thing? Of course, we didn't have anywhere near the technology, i.e. phones and stuff, that was going to happen within the next decade after Netscape going public. So a lot changed, but has geekdom changed from, let's say, 95 until 2023?
I think the ambitions of geeks have gotten bigger, to which I say, hallelujah. You asked me if I wanted to redefine geek. Let me sharpen the definition a little bit. For me, a geek is an obsessive maverick. Obsessive, I can't let go of this problem. Maverick, I am not going to be confined, or I'm not going to feel constrained by what we're doing right now, by the status quo, by the way the incumbents are going about things. If I come up with an answer, even if it's a weird answer, I'm going for it. Smartphones in space. I know that sounds a little weird. I'm going for it. So for me, a geek is an obsessive maverick. And I love your question. And if I think about the difference between now and 1995, think how much territory was available to ambitious geeks just in the classic high-tech sector, just in software, just in this idea that you could move commerce from catalogs to this thing called the web. There was a huge amount of territory out there, but it was confined to mainly digital businesses in industries that pretty clearly had a digital component. And then another wave of opportunity for the geeks came along starting in about 2007 when the iPhone launched and we started to have Web 2.0 and the social web. That was another huge upset. I think what's going on now is that the ambitions of the geeks are unbounded. In other words, they don't see an industry that they can't effectively go after. It's not just retail and advertising and software anymore. We've already talked about cars. We've talked about rockets and satellites. Keep in mind, Hollywood is being shaken up right now. The economics of Hollywood are being transformed. This cozy century-old...
But they deserve it because there's nothing left to watch anymore. After COVID, there's nothing. Everyone's watched everything.
But think where the good content is coming from. It's coming from these weird upstarts. And Hollywood was a stable oligopoly for about a century. And then it's worth going back a little bit and remembering Hollywood has been disrupted by a company that started mailing DVDs around to you in first-class envelopes. That was the original Netflix business idea. This idea that Eureka, movies now come on DVDs as opposed to VHS, and a DVD fits inside a normal first-class envelope. Wow, here's a business opportunity. And it was only after they were doing that for a while that Reed Hastings and his colleagues started to get more ambitious and say, wait a minute, you can stream movies or you will be able to pretty quickly. All right, that was cool. Then they got silly ambitious and they said, we're going to make our own content. Now, think how many companies and how many people have gone to Hollywood with exactly that dream and just been chewed up and spit out by the Hollywood oligopoly. The incumbents in Hollywood were so unimpressed when Netflix announced its ambition to make original content. The head of Time Warner said, I love this quote. He said, it's a little bit like the Albanian army going to take over the world. I don't think so. Reed Hastings apparently got some Albanian army dog tags, started wearing them every day, and they got to work. And Netflix, this DVD by mail origin company, is now disrupting Hollywood. So I look around and I don't see a lot of industries that have moats that are going to keep the geeks away, because the geeks know how to seize an opportunity. They are not afraid. They've got scale. They've got backing now to go after big opportunities. So we're now seeing the geeks appear in different parts of aerospace and defense contracting and financial services, and coming at pharma and biotech and healthcare in different ways. Their ambitions are boundless, thank heaven.
Here's something also, too, as you bring up Netflix. See all these streamers now. There's a lot of Netflix competition now. But I think the typical person turning on most of the streaming content these days is saying to themselves, I can't watch this stuff, or I've seen this stuff. So it seems like to me that we're right back at the point where the upstart Netflix, all of these operations, as you're implying with Hollywood, are set for some type of disruption. And now it's a more specific type of disruption, in my humble opinion, which is content. Most people liked watching Better Call Saul or Breaking Bad and stuff like that.
Present company included.
Stuff that you can just instantly see the quality. You're like, oh, I'll turn into that. I'll binge that. Sopranos, all that stuff, The Wire. But that's pretty rare. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's just filler. So it's going to be interesting as we talk about Netflix as an upstart. It seems like to me there's going to be another opportunity for somebody to come along and say, hold on, let's really focus on content. Even if we can't produce as much as we're currently producing under some of these streamers, let's get back to some quality. Just another thought here as you bring all these issues up. We see the Netflix streaming succeed, but now we see all the other streamers out there. And now there's the issue of, hey, are these people really producing good content now? So it seems like there's another opportunity to come in and upset and disrupt.
And that sounds right to me. It's going to be interesting to see how big that opportunity is. And it's going to be really interesting to see who recognizes it and seizes it. I want to be wrong about this prediction, but I don't think it's going to be one of the legacy incumbents of Hollywood. I think it's going to be a new company, at Netflix's vintage or more recent, because what the new vintage of companies has learned to do better than the old legacy incumbents, and Netflix I'll put with the upstarts in this category, they have learned how to spot and seize an opportunity in the space that they're interested in. And so one of the things I respect about Netflix a lot is that their batting average of putting out stuff and seeing what's next, it's a pretty good batting average. And Hastings, in his book, No Rules Rules, which he wrote with Aaron Meyer, I loved that. I learned a ton from it. Hastings is very clear to say, it is not because I am such a genius or such a visionary about entertainment. And he tells these stories about how he got important decisions wrong. He was just wrong about some important parts of Netflix's growth. And he talks about how he had to build a company that could get important things right, even when he, the founder, the prestigious, the charismatic boss, the visionary, even when he got them wrong. And I think that's an amazing ability. If you can put that in place, good for you, because your batting average just went up. I'm going to mix my sports metaphors. You are getting a lot more high quality shots on goal, but you better figure out how to build a company where even when you are convinced and passionate but wrong, how your company can get past the fact that you're wrong about something important.
Fortune 500 companies, let's say 500 of them. What percentage of them do you think are operating in what you would classify as the geek way?
To answer that question, you can either distribute a survey to all 500, which I would love to do, or you can rely on some previous work that colleagues of mine did. An old friend of mine is a guy named Don Saul, and he is now at MIT with me. He and his brother Charlie did this really interesting piece of research where he said, wait a minute, it used to be hard to understand a company's culture, how it actually worked on the inside. It got a lot easier because people are now leaving reviews for their companies. So he went to Glassdoor and he started up a collaboration with Glassdoor where they let the brothers scrape all of the reviews that employees left for their companies. And then they did a machine learning analysis on all those reviews where they trained the system to recognize whether a review was positive or negative and what the person was talking about. So they labeled a bunch of data to say this is a positive review about agility at the company. Then they had the machine learning system go back and classify all the rest of the reviews, and they were able to quantify culture across about 500 pretty large companies, mainly in the US. And when you look at the data, it's astonishing, because if you look at companies that are in the high-tech sector and you look at companies that are clustered largely in Northern California, that's where you really start to see some cultural elements light up in a way that we haven't seen before. And in particular, the Sols look at three things called execution, agility, and innovation. And wow, do companies that the more high-tech they are, the more they score high on those dimensions, the more they're headquartered fairly close to the old garage in Palo Alto where Hewlett-Packard got started, the higher they do on these things. And that's just some nice external validation for me that we really are seeing something different, incubated in the high-tech industries, incubated in Northern California, but not confined to there anymore.
I want to bring up something that is probably for many people these days, not all, maybe it's a 50-50 divide, but a negative aspect to the Geek Way. So you just brought up HP in the garage. I can think of Apple in the garage. I can think of Google in the garage. I think it was Esther Wojcicki.
Esther's great. Yeah, she's fantastic.
Her daughter was the YouTube CEO. She was on this podcast and she was talking about when they rented out to the Google guys. That was how they all met.
I love it.
I don't think any of those guys starting out, HP, Apple, Google, could have envisioned that their interesting startups would morph in the years to come. And this is one of the biggest negatives that I see these days, to where, and I never could have imagined this in the summer of 95. I couldn't have imagined this probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, to where if I write something on the internet as an American with that little thing we call free speech, and of course, if we say something stupid, then that will get all kinds of ramifications for that. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. But it seems like we did, and bless Elon for whether people like him or love him or hate him or whatever, bless him for making X seemingly open to people saying whatever they want to say these days. But it did seem like in the last handful of years that the Geek Way did come to include censorship. Is that a fair assessment?
Let me use a different word. I would use moderation instead. And as everyone who is running any kind of social platform has told me, you have to exercise some moderating capabilities or judgment if you're going to run a social platform, especially a public social platform. Even if you are philosophically in favor of free speech, what are you going to do about piling on? What are you going to do about harassment? What are you going to do about obscenity? What are you going to do about content that's just incredibly toxic and harmful and abusive? There are trolls out there. And I don't know how you run a social network without taking that stuff into account. So yeah, I'm not surprised that these companies that have become huge global companies, their list of stakeholders and their list of constraints and responsibilities has gotten a lot bigger. I certainly don't like censorship, but at the same time, I don't like the dogpiling and the toxicity that you see on some of these platforms, and responsible platform managers have to deal with that.
Fair point. I was probably going more towards the political side. For example, during the COVID time, there was all kinds of debates that people had. People pro-vax, anti-vax. People want to try this, they want to try that. People don't want to be locked down, they do want to be locked down. I think that was the part that started to get me a little unnerved. Yeah, I think it'd be terrible if there's all of a sudden some young lady, teenager is online and 100 or 1,000 people are targeting this young girl. That's terrible. But on the flip side, I don't want to use the way that you laid that out to include, because it clearly has happened, is the political censorship. And I think that's the part that's frustrating.
It absolutely has happened. And the attempts to censor false information or lies or harmful information about things during the pandemic, these were difficult. I'm not excusing the platforms. I probably would have made some choices different, but this Monday morning armchair quarterbacking is very, very easy. Running a large global platform is an incredibly important, very tricky thing to do. And I do think these companies are trying to do the right thing and not trammel on people's free speech rights more than they have to.
You are very diplomatic on that response.
Michael, it's easy to sit here and dump on it. I cannot imagine trying to run a company and looking at some dashboard where there are on the order of billions of interactions happening in public every day.
Let me phrase you this way. Why did we give them that responsibility?
I'll say it again. If you are running a public social platform, you have a moderation responsibility for no other reason than the trolls will show up and make your business shrink. This is what happened with Reddit. They realized they had to become more interventionist, whether or not the First Amendment was at play or whether or not there was a regulator breathing down their throat. Moderation is difficult. I am not going to sit here and try to think that I've got the perfect answer.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it seems like it's going to be the central issue. I guess I was just pushing a little bit more to find out if there is a way in the geek mindset, how they think about this. Your point's well taken about the moderation part. And I'm sure my point's well taken too about the political side, where that gets frustrating too. If we were to use America as an example, these days you could take both sides and sit them down and they literally can't even agree on the facts anymore.
Which makes the moderation all the more difficult. And one of the weird things that the left and the right in America agree on these days is beating up on big tech. And I want to be clear, all concentrations of power demand vigilance, demand a magnifying glass on them. And these large tech companies are very, very powerful, influential companies by virtue of their sheer size and by virtue of what they do. They provide a forum for free expression. They organize the world's information. These are huge, weighty responsibilities, and we shouldn't give them a pass just because we think the founder had a cool story, or we shouldn't just blindly trust them. But vigilance is different from breaking them up. It's different from intervening heavily in them. And it's different from thinking that if we just put the right people in charge or we put the right commission together, all the problems would go away. These are really tough problems.
Let me shift you back into mindset a little bit. There's a great quote you have in chapter 1 of your book from Steve Jobs. I will read it really quick. The minute that you understand that you can poke life and that you can change it, you can mold it, that's maybe the most important thing. Once you learn it, you'll want to change life and make it better because it's kind of messed up in a lot of ways. Once you learn that, you'll never be the same again. That's just a great line because I think that really brings me back to when I started, where it's like, hey, I've got a chance to make a dent here. I can move the needle. This gets back to my question earlier about the difference between, let's say, 95 and 2023. Even in the geek world, I mean, let's be frank, a lot of people go to work for a company. So they're cogs in the wheel, ultimately. The feeling that Jobs is talking about there is quite different than just having a job. It's truly this revolutionary type feeling. I wonder how many people get a chance in life to truly feel what he has said. I feel like I have on some small level. Never, of course, we will never get the chance to experience it like he did, but it is amazing when you can feel that you had the chance to push the needle a little.
Completely. But there's something else that's amazing, and it's not in opposition to what you just said. It goes hand in hand with it, which is feeling like your work matters, even if your work involves stocking shelves in a convenience store, as opposed to building a rocket that will take humanity to Mars, for example. I talk in the Geek Way a bunch about how much work means to people, if for no other reason than because you spend a lot of your adult life at work. Americans spend a little bit more time at work each week than they do asleep. They spend a little bit more time each week at work than they do with their partner, almost as much time as they do with their children. Just by virtue of the sheer number of waking hours that you spend, your work, unless the company screws it up and sucks the joy out of it, your work is going to be important to you. In addition to which, in addition to sheer time, your work gives you community. It gives you other human beings to interact with. It gives you goals to go after. It gives you the opportunity to teach and to learn. It gives you dignity and meaning. Your work is very, very important, to the point that the surveys are fairly consistent on this. When you ask people, hey, if you won the lottery tomorrow, you just didn't need to work anymore, would you continue to? And a huge majority of people say, yes, I would absolutely continue to work. Surprising to me, that percentage goes up as you go down the wage ladder. People doing entry-level jobs, not the Steve Jobs jobs, the entry-level jobs, their work matters to them as well. And I bring all this up to underscore how important it is to build a company that people want to go work for. And here again, I think the geeks are excelling at this. LinkedIn did this really interesting exercise in 2016. They had a top attractors list. And they said, we're not going to have any subjective elements to this list. We're just going to look at where people apparently want to go work, what companies are really attractive to them. So they looked at the number of applications submitted via the LinkedIn platform. They looked at how many LinkedIn users visited the company page on LinkedIn or the pages of employees. And they looked at how long people stayed in their first job when they went to go work for a company. Very objective measures. You can say whether or not they're perfect or they're good, but these were not subjective. These were objective measures. They published their list in 2016. The top 11 slots on the list, the top 11 slots were populated by what I would call geek companies, tech, West Coast, between Silicon Valley and the Seattle area. They just dominated that list. And it's not because they pay well, because banks also pay well, and banks were far, far lower down that list. And to me, it shows something fundamental. One of the reasons the Geek Way works so well is it's a better fit for us. It makes us feel like we've got a healthier work environment. Levels of responsibility are higher. Levels of autonomy are higher. Freedom to express yourself, psychological safety appears to be better there than in a lot of other places. And they're building very attractive companies to work. I emphasize this because the media coverage of big tech these days, I think, is fairly sharply negative consistently and paints them as these cube farms where you're living the Dilbert existence. That's not what people report who work at these companies. These are extraordinarily attractive places to work.
So it's interesting about what you lay out, and I get it in a way. I can't say I've lived it, but I get it. But to contrast is the Geek Way, and I brought this up earlier, which is the large organization. I'm drawing on my desk with my hands. And then the other operation is the Mike Covel, the guy you're talking to, or the Matt Taibbi, or you just brought up the Dilbert guy. I mean, he's quite a character, but he's doing his thing. Whatever random person we could find on YouTube with 1 million subscribers, or on Twitter, now X, with 1 million subscribers, you're at the Geek Way founder mindset. I see this as twofold: the Geek Way founder and the Geek Way acolyte, or the Geek Way, I'm going to join the team. It's two different things in the same headspace, but they are very different.
They are, but there's, I think, a very clear link between them. So let's start with you and your geek founder colleagues. You saw an opportunity. You threw together a pretty small band of people initially to go after it. My guess is that you interacted in a fairly egalitarian, non-hierarchical way. My guess is that you were not some desk-pounding boss for the initial people that you got to work with on your opportunities. You followed the evidence and you tried stuff. And if somebody didn't like what was going on, or they thought you were doing a dumb thing, they probably spoke up and said so to you. Do I have about all that right?
Yeah, I think also, too, what people like myself learned, and I would guess the examples that I just gave, is I think most people, I'm not one man because there's lots of people helping me to get done what I need to get done. But in a way, I would call myself a one-man shop. I would call Matt Taibbi a one-man shop. Marcus Brownlee, even though he's not a one-man shop, he's one man who started it. This one-man mindset, yeah, it's quite different.
It's very entrepreneurial.
Yeah, it's very entrepreneurial. But like you said, it's in the Geek Way mindset, contrasted to maybe somebody that says, you know what, I don't want to take those kinds of risks that Mike is taking or those other guys are taking. I'd rather go work for the Google guys and make $500,000 a year doing that.
It's a really good point. And you bring up that people have different risk preferences. Some folk are like you. They're willing to go try stuff and devote their career to some wacky ideas that they have. And some people, for whatever set of reasons, want a more predictable, stable job, a more stable income stream or whatever. Now, let's talk about that person that is happy to go work for Google and pull down a big salary. My guess is they still want to interact the way that you and your contractors, you and your team, the way that the people who you interview for this show interact with people. They don't want it to be super hierarchical and top down. The boss just tells you what to do and you execute. Everybody wants to have some psychological safety. They want to be free to bring up if they disagree with something that's going on. They would rather probably do stuff than sit around planning endlessly. And they probably don't want to have to follow the opinion or the judgment of a hippo. Michael, I don't know if you know this acronym. It's my favorite business acronym. It stands for highest paid person's opinion. In other words, I'm not going to follow the evidence. I know what the right thing to do here is. You and your peers are very geeky. What amazes me is how some of the earlier generation of business geeks were able to keep that ethos, that spirit of running a company alive, even as the company got big and even as they started to attract people who didn't share that crazy entrepreneurial mindset. They still wanted these other things that go along with the geek way. They still wanted to make a contribution. They didn't want to sit in a sclerotic bureaucracy all day. They wanted psychological safety. What's fascinating to me is that I think we have companies that are doing a good job, not perfect, but a good job of maintaining those things, even as they become large, dominant global companies. I think that's a hopeful development.
Yeah, of course, I have to lay my bias out, and you can see my bias, and everybody can see my bias. It's not disdain for the large companies, but I'm going to always be that outsider. And even these great big companies that we're talking about, they were started by outsiders. So
completely.
There is something to that. We always love that. We're always going to, you brought up the garage thing with HP. We're always going to love that. Everyone's talked Apple till we're blue in the face, but I mean, how amazing of a story it is. They're flat on the back in the 90s. They're basically dead. Jobs has screwed everything upside and downside. He's been in and out of the company. He's back and he convinces Gates to give him some money. How the hell does he go from that to being the damn biggest company in the world? It's just amazing.
Yeah, it's truly astonishing. I feel lucky that we get to watch this chapter in business history because it's a really, really interesting one. And you bring up something really interesting. When I talked to all these alpha geeks and tried to learn from them as I was researching the Geek Way, I got the very strong impression most of them can still consider themselves to be scrappy outsiders, to still be chasing something big. And even though objectively they know that they're running or they're participating in very large global multinational companies, I don't think that really has seeped into their worldview. They're still just nerdy, geeky people chasing these big opportunities.
Interesting you say that. As a Mac guy, back to I think either 89 or 90, long ago, when people would make fun of me for not using DOS and I was using these Macs and stuff. It's interesting when I think about Apple, it's like, they got some headgear coming out for their virtual reality and stuff, but there's probably a side of me that's saying, when is Apple coming with the next big thing? Or will they? Or will they just keep iterating these great things that I use every day? Is there going to be another next big thing? It keeps us all on the edge of our chairs, so to speak. Will the scrappy outsider Apple, which is obviously not an outsider anymore, will they come up with something new and big? For all of these people and companies that you're talking about, we all want to see the next geek way, so to speak, evolve and come into existence and surprise us and fascinate us.
Completely. We just had one when OpenAI released the public version of ChatGPT. That was less than a year ago. You and I and the rest of the world went, holy freaking Toledo, what is this? What has actually happened here? We now have this technological entity, this system that can do fluent human speech. Whoa, that's just science fiction become reality. I rewatched Ex Machina a while back, this great movie. And the robotics that we have today are not at the level of that movie. But remember, the whole premise of the movie is that this guy gets brought in to talk to this nascent artificial entity and have a conversation with her in this case. And it's about the wonder of talking to a piece of technology like that. We can all do that now for free over the web. So, Michael, I'm with you. The geeks are going to continue to surprise us with what they come up with. And one thing that I really want to have happen, I don't know if it's going to, I'm skeptical. One thing I really want to have happen is for some of those holy Toledo surprises to start coming out of the incumbents of the industrial era, because the market share of holy cow innovation is super, super skewed. And I want it to be less skewed. I want the rest of the economy to be amazing us, not just a bunch of geeks headquartered in Northern California.
Back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I tell you what, when Netscape went public, it put an adrenaline rush in me and it's never left.
There are a lot of people for whom it's never left, and that's great.
The book, The Geek Way, the radical mindset that drives extraordinary results. Look, I just took you into some big picture topics and stuff. People will have to dive in and check the book out and get into the nitty gritty, but I think you represent well to bring people into this mindset. And it is a terribly important mindset. And as like you said at the beginning, once you heard a little bit from me, you're like, well, Mike, you're a geek, so you fit.
It's fantastic to have a tribe, and we're going to keep doing amazing things in the world. I think one of the most fundamental things that the geeks are going to continue to do is build organizations that people want to be part of.
Andy, where can we send people? Book, Amazon, all that fun stuff. Is there a website you want to direct people to?
Yep. So my website is andrewmcafee.org. Andrew and then McAfee, like John McAfee, who is not a relation to me, the antivirus pioneer who's recently deceased. So I'm andrewmcafee.org. I'm a McAfee on Twitter. The Geek Way is available where books are sold, including Amazon and lots of other places. I hope people found it valuable. It was a huge amount of fun to write. There's the mantra at the MIT Media Lab for a while. It was hard fun. This book was hard fun.
Hey, Andy, keep me posted on future work. It was a fun chat.
I will happily do that. Michael, thank you for having me on.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.